Why was everyone so quiet the moment she walked in? Maybe it was the sound of her boots against the tile, steady, measured, unshaken. Or maybe it was the calm in her eyes that unsettled them more than anger ever could. The engineering briefing room at Fort Harrison had been noisy seconds before. Papers rustled, pens clicked, officers traded thinly veiled complaints about deadlines and overruns. But when Colonel Preston Fairchild looked up from his files, the air changed. He leaned back in his chair, lips curving with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "They finally sent us a princess to solve our problems." A few quiet laughs followed, the kind that die in the throats of those smart enough to sense danger. She didn't flinch, didn't move. Major Jessica Redmond simply stood there, cap tucked neatly under her left arm, her right hand extended in a gesture that hung in the air far too long before Fairchild finally, reluctantly, took it. His palm was soft, the kind that didn't know field grit or the sting of hot sand under fire. It was the hand of a man who'd led from air-conditioned offices, who measured leadership in reports, not risk. "Major Jessica Redmond reporting for duty, sir," she said. Her tone was flat, controlled, but the silence that followed had a weight to it, the kind that makes people fidget without knowing why. Fairchild didn't notice, or maybe he did and mistook restraint for weakness. "Welcome to Fort Harrison, Major," he said. "We're in the middle of discussing the infrastructure modernization project. I'm sure you'll want to catch up." He gestured toward an empty chair, but didn't invite her to sit. Jessica stayed standing. Her gaze swept across the room, cataloging faces, not out of insecurity, but precision. She learned long ago that the first room always told you everything you needed to know. To Fairchild's right sat Lieutenant Austin Matthews, barely 30, all confidence and clean uniforms, the kind of officer who'd mastered nodding at the right jokes. He smirked openly, his eyes flicking over Jessica with quiet dismissal. Across from him, Captain Natalie Green kept her gaze on her coffee mug, knuckles white around the handle, shoulders drawn tight. Silent discomfort. A woman who'd seen this kind of scene before and survived it by saying nothing. At the far end, Major Ronald Fitzgerald looked on with weary detachment, the kind of man who'd long ago made peace with cowardice by calling it pragmatism. And at the back of the room, against the wall, stood Command Sergeant Major Wade Nicholson. Older, heavier, weathered by years and consequence. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes were watching, closely, assessing her the way veterans do when they recognize another. Fairchild's voice sliced through the quiet. "The imp has been problematic for 6 months," he said, tapping the thick folder in front of him. "Budget overruns, delays, structural issues. My previous chief engineer couldn't fix it before he requested transfer." A pause, the kind of pause that invited judgment. "I'm sure you'll need time to review the files before offering opinions, Major." Jessica nodded once. "I've already reviewed the preliminary files that were forwarded to me last week." She took a breath, calm, deliberate. The structural issues stem from inadequate soil compaction testing before foundation work began, combined with drainage miscalculations that ignored seasonal water table variations. The overruns are a result of reactive fixes to those oversights rather than proactive engineering assessments. The words landed like quiet detonations. For a moment the room froze. Matthew's smirk faltered. Green looked up startled. Nicholson's eyes narrowed slightly, interest, not surprise. Fairchild set down his pen, slowly. "Is that your professional opinion, Major?" "Yes, sir, based on the documentation available." Fairchild leaned back, voice dripping with false civility. "Fascinating. My last chief engineer held a master's degree in structural engineering and 15 years of experience. I'm sure he simply overlooked those basic principles. Thank you for the insight, Princess." Laughter, quick, brittle, forced, cracked the tension. Matthews barked a short laugh, the kind that didn't know when to stop. Jessica didn't respond, didn't even blink. Because silence, she'd learned, was a weapon. She let it hang there until it became uncomfortable, until even Fairchild shifted in his seat. The meeting dragged on. Fairchild dominated every conversation, cutting off input that didn't echo his own conclusions. He talked about leadership, about discipline, about results. But what Jessica heard beneath it was insecurity, the fragile authority of a man who needed control because he couldn't command respect. She took notes fast, precise, unemotional. But her pen didn't just record facts, it recorded patterns. Ego over expertise. Comfort over competence. Hierarchy over truth. When the briefing ended, officers scattered like birds escaping weather. Only Nicholson stayed, lingering by the door as she gathered her notes. "Major," he said quietly, his gravel voice cutting through the hum of voices outside, "welcome to Fort Harrison." Their eyes met. And in that instant, no words were needed. He knew. She knew. The battlefield had simply changed its shape, but not its nature. Her office turned out to be a basement room, 10 feet by 12, window half buried in dirt, the kind of space where fluorescent lights buzzed like dying insects. A single metal desk waited under layers of dust and neglect. Fairchild's way of saying, "Know your place." Jessica didn't complain. She unpacked her briefcase, cleared the desk, connected her laptop to the network, and began assembling the kind of organization that discipline demands when the world above is chaos. 30 minutes later, the room already looked like an operations post, efficient, alive, purposeful. A knock sounded. "Ma'am," came a voice. Sergeant First Class Craig Sanders stepped in, older, practical, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Building 7's coffee station's 3 floors up," he said. "Most folks assigned down here don't find it until their second week." Jessica took the cup, nodded. "Thank you, Sergeant." Sanders studied the freshly ordered desk, the tidy files, the methodical energy in every movement. "Colonel Fairchild likes to start new engineers down here," he said carefully. "Says it builds character." "Does it?" He gave a small, humorless smile. "Last 3 asked for transfers within a month." Jessica sipped the coffee, strong, fresh. "And what do you think, Sergeant?" Sanders hesitated. Then, quietly, "I think good engineers were driven away by bad leadership, and I think it's a waste." Her eyes met his, calm, steady, the kind of look that said, "You just told the truth to the right person." "Thank you for the coffee," she said. "And for the honesty." When he left, she returned to her desk. But there was a new edge in her focus, something colder, deeper. She opened the first stack of files Fairchild had assigned her. It wasn't a briefing packet. It was a trap. Hundreds of pages of incomplete data, conflicting reports and missing assessments, designed to bury her. By 2200 hours, she was still there, eyes burning under the flickering light, hands moving across blueprints, cross-referencing contractor reports, correcting calculation errors. And somewhere between page 300 and 400, she found it. A pattern. Corners cut. Budgets adjusted. Inspections signed off before completion. Mistakes that weren't just negligent, they were deliberate. At 200 hours, she saved her analysis, packed up her notes, and stepped out into the cold. The base was quiet, floodlights humming over the empty motor pool. She walked back to her quarters alone, her boots echoing against the asphalt. No one saw her pause halfway there. No one heard the whisper she spoke into the night. "Let him underestimate me." By dawn, she'd compiled a full technical report, 12 critical issues, prioritized and referenced, each with specific recommendations for repair and prevention. No opinions, no emotion, just precision and proof. At 6:55, She entered the morning briefing again, on time, composed. Fairchild was already there, his staff assembled, the same smirks, the same hierarchy of silence. "Morning, Princess," he said. "Sleep well." She set a folder on his desk. "Comprehensive analysis of the IMP documentation, sir. Prioritized findings and corrective recommendations." He flipped through the pages lazily, then his eyes slowed, the smirk faltered. "You completed this overnight?" "Yes, sir. The data was sufficient for pattern analysis." "Pattern analysis," he repeated, as though the words themselves offended him. He scanned further, then snapped the folder shut. "You're thorough, I'll give you that. But next time remember, analysis is only as good as its understanding of command realities." She didn't answer. Fairchild leaned back. "You know, Major, some of us learned the hard way that the field isn't a classroom. You can't always apply textbook logic out there." "I've learned that, sir," she said evenly. "Good, then you won't mind your next task." He smiled, the kind of smile that meant the game was still his to play. "There's a supply depot on the east end of base. 15 years of accumulated inventory. I want it cataloged, completely. Every crate, every item, by Friday." It was Tuesday. Jessica didn't blink. "Understood, sir." As she turned to leave, Nicholson's voice came quietly from behind. "Ma'am," he said, "that depot hasn't been organized in a decade. He's setting you up." She met his eyes. "I know." Then, softly, the kind of quiet resolve that only comes from someone who's already survived worse. "And I'll do it anyway." Nicholson's expression shifted, something almost like respect breaking through the weary mask of rank. He didn't say another word. And as she walked away, the base lights caught the faint bronze gleam of the metal ribbons on her chest, ribbons most people in that room hadn't bothered to notice. They would. Eventually. Because sometimes, dignity doesn't defend itself with words. It proves itself in silence through action. And Major Jessica Redmond was about to do exactly that. Why did he send her there? Why the depot, that warehouse graveyard of forgotten supplies and failed officers? Maybe it was punishment. Maybe it was amusement. Or maybe Colonel Fairchild simply wanted to see how long it would take before she broke. Fort Harrison Supply Depot 12 sat at the far edge of the installation, a rusted skeleton of a structure sprawled across several acres. The lock on the main door stuck when she turned the key, flacking rust across her hands. The door groaned open. And the smell hit first, metal, dust, oil, and years of neglect. Inside, shadows swallowed everything beyond the flicker of emergency lights. Pallets towered to the ceiling. Equipment from decades of service stood abandoned and half-labeled. Crates split open, contents spilling like memories no one cared to claim. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a place forgotten, and deliberately so. Jessica stood there for a long moment, eyes adjusting, mind calculating. She understood exactly what Fairchild had done. A warehouse this size, 100,000 square feet, couldn't be cataloged by one person in 4 days. It wasn't just unrealistic. It was mathematically impossible. Which was the point? He didn't want results. He wanted failure. She found a clipboard in the small office near the entrance, cracked plastic, half a pencil attached by string. The log sheets were old. The last entry was dated 3 years ago. Jessica wrote one new line at the top. Inventory, Major Jessica Redmond. Commenced 800 hours. Then she went to work. Row by row, crate by crate, she began her grid. Measuring, labeling, documenting serial numbers not in condition. No one came to help, no one was assigned. By noon, her uniform was streaked with dust and grease. Sweat traced lines down her neck. Her handwriting stayed steady, though her fingers ached from constant movement. At 1300 hours, Sergeant Major Nicholson appeared in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the sunlight outside, a bottle of water in one hand, a portable work lamp in the other. "You'll need this," he said, setting the lamp down. "The lights in here fail after sunset, and that's not the kind of darkness you want to work in." Jessica looked up from the clipboard. "Thank you, Sergeant Major." He studied her, saw the fatigue forming around her eyes, the dust coating her boots, the quiet fire that refused to dim. "The last officer who tried this lasted 4 hours," he said, then requested transfer. "Was he wrong to quit?" "No, ma'am," Nicholson said after a pause. "Just honest. Fairchild uses this place as a test he knows can't be passed. It's not about inventory, it's about humiliation." Jessica nodded slowly, tightening the strap on her glove. "Then we'll see how he handles disappointment." He blinked, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "most people here don't realize how dangerous quiet confidence can be." Then he left, but she noticed he didn't take the lamp with him. By dusk, the depot had become her battlefield. The whine of the fluorescent lights above mixed with the scrape of her boots and the scratch of her pen. Every box she opened revealed history, rusted tools, outdated tech, ammunition crates from operations long forgotten. She cataloged it all, not for Fairchild, not even for herself, but because doing the job right, no matter who tried to weaponize it, was its own kind of defiance. At 2300 hours, her flashlight dimmed to its final flicker. She kept going under the beam of the lamp Nicholson had left behind. The hours blurred, the air thickened, her eyes burned, but the rows she finished became order carved out of chaos. By 200, she'd covered almost a third of the warehouse, far more than anyone had managed before. When she finally stopped, she leaned against a stack of crates, catching her breath. And in that exhausted stillness, she smiled. Because for the first time since arriving, the mission felt familiar. The dust, the exhaustion, the endless logistics, it all echoed the places that had shaped her. The nights spent under fire, rebuilding bridges in the dark, calculating stability while artillery landed too close. Those memories weren't ghosts, they were anchors. Fairchild didn't know it yet, but the warehouse he'd meant as punishment had just reminded her who she was. 4 hours later, her alarm went off. 500. She was already up. By 5:30, she was back in the depot, clipboard in hand, moving through the next section with the same mechanical precision. At 1100 hours, Captain Andrew Burton found her. He stood there for a long moment, taking in the sight of the senior engineer working alone in the half-lit hangar, sweat dripping from her hairline, sleeves rolled up, movements exact. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I wanted to check on you." She looked up briefly. Checking on me or checking on the colonel's latest trap? Burton hesitated, then sighed. "Both, I guess. Fairchild's assigned this same task to 3 officers in the last 2 years. None of them finished. And when they couldn't, he used it to justify transfers, said they weren't cut out for real field work." Jessica nodded, still writing. "And you?" "I think this is wrong," he said. "You're the best engineer we've had here in years. That imp analysis you did, no one's come close to that kind of detail. He's afraid of you." Jessica paused just for a moment. "Fear makes people stupid, Captain. Don't let it make you silent too." Burton swallowed hard. "Ma'am, even if you finish this, even if you pull off the impossible, he'll find another way to discredit you." "Then I'll finish this too," she said simply. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. Instead, he set down a paper bag, a sandwich, a bottle of water. "At least eat something." She gave him a small nod. "Thank you." He left without another word, but when he returned that evening, he brought another lamp. By Thursday, she'd covered 90% of the depot. Her hands were raw, her boots left streaks through the dust. She, slept less than 12 hours in 4 days. But her records were immaculate. Pages of clean handwriting, accurate counts, condition reports, cross-reference documentation. The depot that had once been chaos was now a blueprint of order. At dawn Friday, she finished the final row, locked her clipboard and compiled her summary. $63,000 in missing equipment. $147,000 in outdated materials requiring disposal. 22 safety violations demanding immediate attention. When she walked into Fairchild's office at 900, he didn't look up at first. He was signing papers, probably waiting to enjoy whatever failure she was about to deliver. Jessica placed the report on his desk. Complete inventory and condition assessment, sir. He looked up, eyebrows raised, voice careful. You're telling me you completed that entire depot in 4 days? Yes, sir. And I've already forwarded safety violation reports to Chief Warrant Officer Brennan, per regulation. That last sentence landed like a strike. Fairchild froze. You reported violations before clearing them through chain of command. Regulations require immediate reporting of safety hazards, she said calmly. They're not discretionary. For a long, tense moment, neither spoke. Then Fairchild snapped the folder shut. This is excessive. Nobody asked for this level of detail. The assignment was to conduct a full inventory and condition assessment, she replied evenly. That's what I did. He leaned back in his chair, jaw tightening. You've created unnecessary problems, Major. These reports will trigger investigations, inspections, paperwork. Safety hazards don't vanish when ignored, sir, she said quietly. They just wait for the right moment to become tragedies. His eyes hardened. Dismissed. She saluted sharply and turned to leave. Outside, Nicholson waited in the hallway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Ma'am, he said, Chief Brennan just called me. She said your report documented hazards that have existed for years. She's conducting a full inspection this afternoon. Jessica nodded once. Good. He paused, then added, the colonel not going to take that well. Integrity rarely is convenient, Sergeant Major. Nicholson's eyes narrowed, respect mixing with warning. He's requested your complete service record, told Lieutenant Matthews he wants to review your actual qualifications. She didn't react, just shifted the folder under her arm. When did he make that request? This morning, right after you left his office. He hesitated, then added quietly, he thinks your record will prove him right, that you're all talk and no field experience. Jessica met his gaze. Then he's in for an education. She walked past him, the faint hum of the flickering lights overhead punctuating each step. That night in her small apartment, she unlocked the drawer of her personal safe. Inside, wrapped in velvet, lay 3 medals, dull bronze against the soft light. Each one carried a story no one here knew. One earned building fortifications under mortar fire. One for reconstructing a bridge in hostile territory under sniper overwatch. And one for a night that wasn't supposed to exist in any report. She ran a thumb across the edge of the third. The metal was cool, heavy, real. Colonel Fairchild thought he was digging for proof of incompetence. What he'd find was something the record could never fully explain. Years spent doing the work others avoided, in places where mistakes cost lives. But she didn't want vindication. She wanted something harder. Change. Not for her. For the next princess, who walked into a room full of men who'd already decided who she was. She locked the medals away again and sat in the quiet. Outside, trucks rumbled across the base, their engines echoing faintly through the window. And in the soft dark, Jessica Redmond whispered to herself, not a vow, not a prayer, just a statement of fact. Let him look, let him learn. Because she knew the truth. Sometimes the only way to expose arrogance is to let it dig its own grave. What did he expect to find? A weakness, a gap, something in her record he could hold up like a weapon. Maybe that's what arrogance does. It mistakes mystery for deceit, silence for guilt. When Colonel Fairchild received the manila envelope stamped confidential, official service records, he didn't open it right away. He poured himself a coffee first, sat down, smiled to himself, a slow, self-satisfied grin that tasted like victory. He believed he'd finally cornered her. "Let's see what our princess is really made of," he murmured. Inside were 12 years of military history, lines of data, assignments, evaluations, awards. To the untrained eye it looked ordinary. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood. Officer candidate school at Fort Benning, middle third of her class. Construction battalion at Fort Polk. Transfer to Fort Belvoir. Competent, but not exceptional. And then the gap. 3 years of classified assignment under Special Projects Division, engineering coordination. No details. No reports. Just redacted lines and sealed citations. He chuckled. "Engineering coordination," he said, leaning back. "Administrative support, desk work that got stamped classified because someone upstairs thought it sounded important." Lieutenant Matthews, standing nearby like a loyal shadow, grinned. "So the mystery years were just paperwork." "Exactly," Fairchild said. "Paperwork, meetings, reports, the kind of thing people exaggerate to make themselves look important." He flipped to the awards section. 3 Bronze Stars. 2 campaign medals. Service commendations. He waved them off with a scoff. "They hand these out like candy now. Show up to a deployment, fill out your forms, get a Bronze Star." Matthews nodded, because that's what career climbers do. They agree with power, not truth. Fairchild closed the folder with theatrical precision. "She's been pretending," he said softly. "Pretending to be something she's not. That ends tomorrow." The next morning, whispers moved through Fort Harrison like wind through tall grass. "Did you hear? There's going to be a briefing. He's going to expose her record. He's calling her out in front of everyone." By sunrise, the entire officer corps knew something was coming. Major Jessica Redmond didn't need anyone to tell her. She could feel it. The air in Building 7 was thicker that day. The stares lasted longer. Even silence seemed to follow her like a shadow. At 700, she entered the main conference room. Every seat was full. Even the officers who rarely showed up on time were there, notebooks open, pretending to look busy. Nicholson stood against the back wall, arms folded, eyes narrowed. Captain Green sat stiffly, jaw tight. Burton looked tense, restless. Matthews wore a smirk that could curdle milk. Fairchild walked in last. Last, always deliberate. He carried her personnel folder like evidence at trial. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to clarify something for the benefit of this command." The tone was civil, but the words came sharpened. "We've all had the pleasure of working with Major Redmond these past few weeks. She's confident, opinionated, and not shy about offering critique." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. "To ensure transparency, I requested her complete service record. What I found was enlightening." He opened the folder with exaggerated care. The sound of paper on paper echoed in the dead quiet room. Major Redmond began her career as a construction engineer. Routine assignments, standard garrison work, middle-of-the-road performance. He looked up briefly, smiling. Competent enough, but not exceptional. Nicholson's jaw clenched. Green looked down. Burton stared at his notes like they could save him. Fairchild continued, voice growing more smug with each line. "She later transferred to Fort Belvoir for administrative coordination work, basically Interagency paperwork. He paused for effect. Then came 3 years of classified duty with Special Projects Division, engineering coordination. Sounds impressive, doesn't it? Classified always does. A few chuckles forced uneasy. But I know classified coordination work when I see it, he went on. Meetings, emails, reports, paper pushing with a fancy stamp on top, not field work, not combat engineering. He turned a page, tapping the line that listed her medals. 3 bronze stars. Again, sounds heroic, but anyone who's deployed knows they hand those out for good behavior now. File your paperwork, meet your deadlines, don't make trouble, congratulations, you're a war hero. The silence that followed wasn't agreement. It was discomfort. Everyone knew what was happening. They were watching a superior officer dismantle one of his own in public. And no one, not one person, dared to stop it. Let be clear, Fairchild said finally, closing the folder. Major Redmond is a fine administrator. She can write excellent reports, keep tidy documentation, and organize information beautifully. But this, he gestured to the officers around him, is an operational command. We make real engineering decisions that affect real lives, and that requires experience she simply doesn't have. He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. From now on, Major Redmond will focus on administrative coordination. Leave the field decisions to those with actual combat engineering experience. He looked around the room. Any questions? Silence. He turned toward her. Major Redmond, do you have anything to add? Every head turned. Jessica stood slowly. Her expression didn't change. Her voice, when it came, was soft, so calm it unnerved even those who agreed with Fairchild moments earlier. No, sir, she said. I have nothing to add. Good, he smiled again, dismissive. Then we'll proceed with the agenda. She sat, took out her notebook, and began taking notes, just like any other officer. The meeting continued, training schedules, budget updates, maintenance reports. For the next 90 minutes, she said nothing. But every second she was watching, listening, measuring. Because she understood something Fairchild didn't. Character reveals itself loudest in silence. When the briefing ended, officers filed out quickly, avoiding her gaze like she was contagious. Matthews lingered. As she passed, he muttered, loud enough for others to hear, "Don't take it personally, Princess. Not everyone's built for the real stuff." She didn't even look at him. Just kept walking. In the hallway, Captain Green caught up to her, voice low, urgent. "Ma'am, that was wrong. Everything about that was wrong." Jessica stopped at the top of the stairwell. "What do you want me to do about it, Captain?" "File a complaint, report him, something. He humiliated you publicly." Jessica turned her head, eyes steady. "And what happens after that?" Green hesitated. "He'll retaliate, you know he will." "Exactly. So instead of giving him another excuse, I'll do my job. And when the truth comes out, because it always does, I'll still be standing." Green swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I wish I had your strength." "No," Jessica said quietly. "You do. You're just still choosing when to use it." Then she descended the stairs, back to the basement, back to the flickering light that had become her refuge. Word spread fast. By noon, the entire installation was whispering. In the motor pool, mechanics debated whether Fairchild was right. In the dining hall, NCOs shook their heads, muttering about command climate. In the barracks, young officers whispered stories about the princess, who'd been dressed down in front of everyone. And somewhere in the NCO club, Sergeant Major Nicholson sat with his coffee, staring at nothing. Across from him, Sergeant First Class Walter Pierce leaned forward. "Sir, that briefing this morning, did you see anything in that file that actually supported what Fairchild said?" Nicholson took a long sip, then set his cup down. "I saw the same record he did, administrative assignments, Classified coordination. On paper, he's not wrong. But you don't believe it, Pierce said. Nicholson didn't answer immediately. His eyes were tired, but behind them something was shifting. No, he said finally, I don't. Pierce leaned in. Then do something, Sergeant Major, because if he's wrong about her, and I think he is, then he's not just destroying one officer, he's damaging this entire command. Nicholson exhaled slowly. You ever learn the difference between loyalty and obedience, Sergeant? Pierce frowned, not officially. Obedience is following orders. Loyalty is telling the truth when the person giving them is wrong. That night the base grew quiet again. In her small quarters, Jessica sat by the window, the soft hum of the radiator mixing with the faint buzz of the fluorescent streetlights outside. She didn't cry, she didn't rage. She'd seen far worse forms of humiliation. In one of her deployments, a contractor had refused to take orders from her because she was just a woman. 2 days later, mortar fire had taken down half his project site, and it was her team that rebuilt it under the smoke and fire of an active combat zone. She learned then what she was remembering now. Dignity isn't given. It's built piece by piece, like a structure you intend to last. She looked down at her hands, calloused, rough, scarred. Not from typing memos. From carrying steel beams and tools across sand that melted underfoot. Fairchild could mock her, dismiss her, strip her authority in public. But he couldn't rewrite the truth. And truth, she knew, has a way of surfacing. Somewhere else on base, Nicholson was at his computer, fingers hovering over keys he wasn't supposed to press. He had clearance more than most, but what he was about to do wasn't part of his job description. He accessed a personnel verification database, the kind senior NCOs used for background vetting. He typed, Redmond Jessica A. Engineering Corps. The first page looked standard. The second looked familiar. Then came the third. And what he saw made his blood run cold. Her classified coordination hadn't been administrative. It had been direct engineering support for special operations. Combat zones. Hostile territory. Denied areas. Her job hadn't been paperwork. It had been survival. He couldn't see everything, too many redactions, too many locked files, but he saw enough. Enough to know that Fairchild's princess had built fortifications under fire, reinforced compounds for special units deep in enemy territory, designed structures that had saved lives, quietly, without recognition. He leaned back, staring at the screen. His hand shook slightly as he closed the laptop. Because now he knew the truth. And the question was what to do with it. Fairchild thought he'd won. But arrogance always mistakes silence for surrender. And Jessica Redmond, the officer he'd called princess, was not done. Not by a long shot. Because the real war hadn't even begun yet. It wasn't going to be fought with weapons. It was going to be fought with truth. And truth, once it starts to surface, doesn't stop halfway. How long can truth stay buried before it starts to claw its way to the surface? Sometimes it doesn't need help, just time. And sometimes it finds its own messengers. The next morning, rain rolled over Fort Harrison like an afterthought. Gray skis, wet concrete, the kind of cold that made uniforms feel heavier. Major Jessica Redmond walked across the courtyard alone, cap low, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. Her boots splashed through shallow puddles, each step deliberate, controlled. People watched her now. Not with open hostility, but with something quieter, curiosity mixed with discomfort. The way people look at someone they've already judged, but aren't quite sure if they were right. She didn't care. The truth didn't need an audience. In his office, Colonel Fairchild leaned over his desk, coffee steaming beside him. Lieutenant Matthews stood near the window, watching the rain. Fairchild's voice was sharp, impatient. "Where's the follow-up on Redmond's reassignment paperwork?" "Still pending, sir," Matthews said. "Admin waiting on justification details." "Then write them," Fairchild snapped. "I want her moved to logistics, something quiet, something irrelevant." Matthews hesitated. "Sir, the inspection from Chief Brennan came back. The depot Redmond cataloged. Her report was accurate, completely. They verified every entry, found violations that could have caused serious accidents." Fairchild looked up slowly, eyes narrowing. "So she got lucky." "With respect, sir," Matthews said carefully, "Chief Brennan called her analysis textbook perfect. Even said it should be used as a training model for future audits." Fairchild's expression hardened. "Then it's a shame she won't be around to train anyone." He stood, walking toward the window, watching the rain streak across the glass. "She's smart, I'll give her that, but smart doesn't mean she belongs here. Fort Harrison doesn't need moral crusaders, it needs order." Matthews nodded, but his voice was quieter now. "Understood, sir." Fairchild turned to him, eyes cold. "And remember, Lieutenant, loyalty up, not down." "Yes, sir." But even as he said it, something in Matthews' tone faltered, the first crack in his obedience. Meanwhile, across base, Nicholson sat in the dim light of his small office, the computer screen reflecting off his glasses. He stared at the restricted file he'd opened the night before. He'd seen enough to know she wasn't who Fairchild claimed she was. But proving it was another story. He couldn't just walk into Fairchild's office waving classified records. That would bury them both. He needed confirmation, someone who'd served with her. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair, then picked up the phone. He dialed a number from memory, one that hadn't been used in years. "Sergeant Major Nicholson," came a voice on the other end, gravelly and calm. "It's been a long time." "Too long, Colonel Hayes. Last time we spoke, you owed me a beer and a story." "I still do," Nicholson said, "and I've got one you'll want to hear." There was a pause, then Hayes' tone shifted from amused to alert. "Go on." "Do you remember a field engineer by the name of Jessica Redmond?" Another pause. Then softly, "You mean the Major Redmond from Operation Mistral?" Nicholson sat up straighter. "So you do know her?" "Know her?" Hayes said, almost incredulous. "She built us a way out of hell. Without her, half my platoon wouldn't have made it home." Nicholson's jaw tightened. "Here they're calling her Princess. Fairchild's trying to drive her out." The line went quiet for a long moment. When Hayes spoke again, his voice carried the weight of command and disbelief. "I'll be there by the end of the week." By Friday, word spread that a visiting inspection officer was arriving, Colonel Samuel Hayes, Special Operations Engineering Liaison. No one knew why, but Fairchild assumed it was another administrative visit. He wasn't worried. Not yet. Jessica didn't know any of this. She spent her week buried in work, infrastructure reviews, new proposal drafts, and the endless paperwork Fairchild kept assigning in hopes of drowning her. Every report she submitted was immaculate. Every recommendation backed by data, not emotion. It wasn't revenge. It was discipline. Because she'd learned that sometimes, the best way to fight a war you can't declare is to win every battle they don't think matters. At night she sat alone in her quarters, reading through old field notebooks. Not memories, lessons. She remembered the bridge she'd rebuilt under fire, the field hospital she'd reinforced during a flood, the walls that stood because she refused to let them fall. She thought about the soldiers who'd called her ma'am with respect, not because they had to, but because she'd earned it. And she realized something that made her heart tighten. It was Fairchild she was fighting. It was the system that built men like him. Colonel Hayes arrived on base on a quiet Sunday morning. Unannounced, uncelebrated. Fairchild was caught off guard. When Hayes entered the command office, tall, weathered, calm, Fairchild straightened like a man caught mid-lie. "Colonel Hayes," he said with forced enthusiasm, "welcome to Fort Harrison. If I'd known you were coming—" "You'd have prepared a show," Hayes interrupted lightly, shaking his hand. "I prefer honesty over theater, Colonel." Fairchild forced a laugh. "Of course, to what do we owe the visit?" Hayes' eyes drifted around the room, taking in every detail: the polished desk, the framed commendations, the walls of controlled ego. "Routine assessment," he said. "We're reviewing officer integration in mixed-unit commands." Fairchild relaxed slightly. "Ah, perfect timing then. We've been adjusting to new personnel." "Like Major Jessica Redmond?" Hayes asked casually. Fairchild's smile froze. "Ah, yes, our newest transfer. Bright, hardworking, but not quite seasoned for our tempo." Hayes nodded, unreadable. "I see." Then, without breaking eye contact, he asked, "Did you review her record?" "I did." "And—" Fairchild leaned back. "Ordinary, inflated maybe. She's not field-ready, never was." Hayes studied him for a long, heavy second. Then softly, "You have no idea who she is, do you?" Fairchild frowned. "Excuse me. Do you know what she did at Mistral Outpost? Or how many lives her paperwork saved during Operation Deep Current?" Fairchild blinked, thrown off balance. I wasn't aware she was involved in those." Hayes stepped closer, voice quiet but sharp. "She was more than involved. She designed the evacuation route after the initial blast, built it in 3 hours under enemy fire using salvaged steel and prayer. The same route that saved 46 men, including me." Fairchild's mouth opened, but no words came. Hayes leaned in slightly. "So before you dismiss her as unqualified, understand this. She's done more with a wrench and a blueprint under fire than most officers do with a battalion at their back." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that humbles. Hayes stepped back, composed again. "I'd like to meet her, personally." "Of course," Fairchild managed. "I'll arrange it." "Don't bother," Hayes said. "I already did." Nicholson found Jessica in the depot again, her chosen sanctuary. She was recalibrating structural test equipment, lost in thought. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you have a visitor." She turned, wiping her hands. "A visitor?" Nicholson smiled faintly. "Colonel Hayes, Special Operations Engineering." Her face changed, not surprise, not fear, something softer. "Hayes," she murmured. "I haven't heard that name in years." "He's waiting for you in the admin building." She nodded once, then set down her clipboard and left without a word. When she walked into the office, Hayes stood near the window, posture straight, hands behind his back. He turned at the sound of the door. For a second, neither spoke. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that carries 1,000 memories and one deep respect. "Major Redmond," he said quietly, "it's been a long time." 3 years, she replied, "since Mistral." He nodded. "I still remember the way that bridge held." "It wasn't supposed to," she said softly, "but it had to." They stood in silence for a moment, 2 soldiers bound by a memory most people could never understand. Hayes' tone shifted lower now. "I heard what Fairchild's been doing." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter." "It does," he said, "because what he's doing isn't just about you. It's about what you represent: competence without ego, strength without noise. Men like him fear that." She looked down, her voice quiet. "I don't want to fight him. I just want to do my job." Hayes nodded. "Then keep doing it. I'll handle the rest." That afternoon, Fairchild called an emergency leadership briefing. The mood was tense, officers whispering, trying to guess why a special operations colonel was suddenly walking the halls of Fort Harrison. When the meeting began, Hayes sat silently at the end of the table, hands folded, expression unreadable. Fairchild started as usual, confident, rehearsed, dripping authority. But halfway through, Hayes interrupted. "Colonel," he said mildly, "I've reviewed your command reports. I'm curious, how do you define leadership?" Fairchild blinked. "Excuse me." "Leadership," Hayes repeated. "What does it mean to you?" Fairchild cleared his throat. "Setting standards, enforcing discipline, maintaining order." Hayes nodded slowly. "Interesting, because I define it as this, setting the example you want others to follow." The room went still. Then Hayes continued, calm but razor-sharp. "When you humiliate subordinates, when you twist the truth to feed your pride, that's not order. That's insecurity wearing rank." No one breathed. Fairchild's face flushed red. "With all due respect, sir." "No," Hayes said, voice like a quiet thunder. "With all due respect to her." He turned to Jessica. "Major Redmond, you're to prepare a full readiness report for the base's engineering division. Effective immediately, you'll coordinate directly with my office for oversight." Fairchild stared at him, stunned. "You're reassigning her." "Promoting her," Hayes corrected. "Temporarily, until I decide whether Fort Harrison's leadership structure still reflects Army values." The silence that followed could have shattered glass. Hayes stood, buttoned his jacket, and nodded to Jessica. "Good to see you again, Major." She saluted sharply. "You too, sir." Then he turned to Fairchild. "You may want to review your definition of leadership, Colonel. You're going to need it." When the room finally emptied, Fairchild sat alone, staring at the folder still on his desk, the one with her name on it. It looked different now. He looked different now. But arrogance dies slowly, and revenge, when wounded, becomes dangerous. That night, rain fell harder. Jessica sat by her window, the same quiet strength in her eyes. The war wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, she wasn't standing alone. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. And beneath it, her whispered thought cut through the noise like a blade. You can't humiliate what refuses to bow. What happens when arrogance feels cornered? It stops pretending. It stops smiling. And it starts fighting dirty. The day after Colonel Hayes' visit, the mood at Fort Harrison changed, not openly but subtly. Eyes that once dismissed her now watched with quiet caution. The jokes stopped, the whispers softened. But in leadership offices, behind closed doors, Fairchild was a storm contained by paperwork. He hadn't been demoted, not yet. But his authority, his illusion of control had been fractured. And men like him don't heal from that. Jessica felt it before she saw it. Her reports began coming back delayed. Requests went missing. Emails disappeared from the system. A requisition she'd submitted for new testing equipment, denied. A project she'd already approved, suddenly under review. It wasn't random. It was calculated. Colonel Fairchild was still her commanding officer on paper, and while he couldn't confront her publicly after Hayes' visit, he could choke her progress quietly, death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. On Wednesday morning, Captain Natalie Green appeared at Jessica's door, holding a folder close to her chest. "Ma'am," she said softly, closing the door behind her, "you need to see this." Jessica looked up from her laptop. "What is it?" Green placed the folder on the desk. Inside were printed emails, digital requisitions she'd sent days earlier. "Every document you submitted this week was rerouted through admin and flagged as pending Colonel approval. It's not standard protocol. He's intercepting your paperwork." Jessica stared at the pages, jaw tightening slightly. "How did you get these?" Green hesitated. "Sergeant Pearson, he's not a fan of how the Colonel runs things. Said he noticed the reroute tags." Jessica's eyes flicked over the data, timestamps, IDs, digital footprints. Each one a breadcrumb leading back to the same user. C. Fairchild Admin. She closed the folder gently. "Thank you, Captain. This stays between us." Green nodded, lowering her voice. Ma'am, he's trying to build a case. He told Matthews you've been bypassing protocol, that you're going rogue. Jessica exhaled slowly. Let him talk. Ma'am, if he's gathering signatures and data. I said let him talk. Her voice was calm, but her hands, folded on the desk, were trembling just enough for Green to notice. Not fear. Rage restrained by discipline. Green left quietly. Jessica sat there for a long time after, staring at the rain streaking across the small window. She wasn't new to sabotage. She'd faced worse from enemies with rifles, but this was different, the kind of attack that couldn't be countered with courage or strength. It demanded something harder. Patience. That night she went for a walk around the perimeter road. The air was cold, crisp, stars veiled by low clouds. Nicholson caught up with her near the motor pool. Ma'am, he said, falling into step beside her, heard about your paperwork getting lost. Of course you did, she said softly. He half smiled. This base has more ears than walls. They walked in silence for a while, boots crunching on gravel, the faint hum of generators filling the air. Finally, Nicholson said, You know he's not going to stop. Hayes rattled him. He's trying to rebuild control the only way he knows how, by breaking what threatens him. Jessica nodded. I know. So what's your move? Finish the readiness report. Deliver it directly to Hayes. No detours, no approvals. Nicholson gave a slow nod. You think Fairchild will let that happen? He doesn't have to. He just has to watch it happen. The next day, she called a staff briefing. The engineers, captains, and NCOs gathered, the same faces that had once looked at her with polite dismissal. She stood at the front of the room, calm, collected. A projector screen behind her glowed faintly with a base diagram, color-coded zones, operational risk areas, incomplete safety certifications. Fort Harrison's readiness, she began, is not as stable as our reports suggest. I've spent the last 2 weeks cross-verifying data across engineering, logistics, and maintenance branches. What I found. She clicked to the next slide. Are inconsistencies in infrastructure inspection cycles. Some reports signed off 6 months early, some never reviewed at all. A murmur rippled through the room. Fairchild wasn't there, but his shadow was in the form of Matthews, seated near the back, expression unreadable. Jessica continued, her voice steady, low. I'm not assigning blame. I'm identifying risk. We can fix this, but we can't do it by hiding behind rank or habit. She paused, scanning faces. Some guilty, some skeptical, all listening. This isn't about pride. It's about people. The walls we build, the systems we test, they protect lives. Every shortcut we allow puts someone's son or daughter in danger. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Then slowly, Sergeant Pierce, the IT tech, raised a hand. Ma'am, he said, if you need help cross-verifying those logs, I'm in. I've seen the gaps too. Another voice joined, me too. Then another. And another. By the time the meeting ended, a third of the engineering division had volunteered to assist. It wasn't a rebellion. Not yet. But it was something Fairchild hadn't expected, respect earned quietly, one act of integrity at a time. By Friday, the storm broke. Jessica arrived at her office to find the door sealed with an inspection in progress notice. Inside, 2 MPs were cataloging her files. Ma'am, one said carefully, we've been ordered to secure your workstation for review. Command audit. By whose order? Colonel Fairchild, ma'am. She said nothing, just stepped aside, letting them pass. Nicholson arrived moments later, face grim. He's accusing you of unauthorized data access. Says you've been manipulating inspection reports. Her voice stayed even. You know that's false. I do, he said, but he's already sent it up to Division HQ. He's hopping to force a suspension before Hayes can intervene. Jessica looked past him, through the glass panel at the MPs, packing her hard drives into evidence bags. Then let him finish digging. Nicholson frowned. What? She turned to him. When people like him dig graves for others, they rarely notice when they've started standing in them. That night, as rain hammered the base, Fairchild poured himself another drink. He'd done it. Redmond would be suspended by morning. His power, his image, would be restored. But arrogance, like alcohol, blurs judgment. Because while he celebrated, Nicholson was in the comms office, dialing Hayes' secure line. "Sir," he said when the line clicked, "we have a situation. Redmond's being set up. Data manipulation, command audit, all falsified." Hayes' voice was quiet but firm. "Send me everything tonight." "Yes, sir." Nicholson hung up, inserted a flash drive, and began transferring every file, every record, every timestamp, every digital fingerprint that pointed back to Fairchild's manipulation. He wasn't doing it for Redmond. He was doing it for the truth. Because he'd seen too many good soldiers crushed under bad leaders, and this time he wasn't going to be silent. The next morning came hard. Jessica reported as ordered, standing outside the command office, uniform flawless, expression calm. Fairchild looked up from his desk when she entered. "Major Redmond," he said coldly. "Effective immediately, you're placed on administrative suspension pending investigation for data tampering and procedural misconduct." She didn't blink. "May I ask what evidence supports this allegation, sir?" He smiled, handing her a folder. "Digital logs, modified reports traced to your terminal, your password, your credentials." She opened the folder. The timestamps were precise, too precise. "I didn't alter these," she said evenly. "Of course not," he said with mock sympathy. "But we can't overlook protocol breaches, can we?" He stood, walking around the desk, lowering his voice. "You thought Hayes would save you. He's gone now. And you're just another officer who thought she could rewrite the system." Jessica closed the folder gently. "You're right," she said quietly. "I did think I could change something here." She turned to leave. "Where are you going?" he asked sharply. She looked back over her shoulder. "To wait, because that's what truth does, sir. It waits until lies get tired." At 1400 hours, a black SUV rolled through Fort Harrison's gates. Hayes stepped out, expression grim, a folder in hand. Fairchild's secretary barely had time to stand before he walked past her and into the colonel's office. Fairchild looked up, startled. "Colonel Hayes, I wasn't expecting." "No," Hayes interrupted, "you were." He dropped the folder onto the desk. Inside, printouts, logs, message traces. All showing one thing. Every falsified modification. Every redirected file. Every digital footprint, his. Fairchild's face drained of color. This isn't." Hayes' voice cut through him like steel. "You forged evidence against a decorated officer. You intercepted federal data channels. You violated command integrity." Fairchild's mouth opened, but no sound came. Hayes leaned closer, eyes cold. "I served in war zones, Colonel. I've seen men make mistakes under fire. But what you did, that's not a mistake. That's cowardice with paperwork." He straightened. "You're relieved of command, effective immediately." The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was justice arriving without ceremony. Outside, Jessica stood near the motor pool, watching the sun break through thinning clouds. Nicholson approached quietly. "He's out," he said. "Division confirmed it. Hayes personally escorted him off base." She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. Just nodded once. "Ma'am," Nicholson said softly, "I've been in the Army 30 years. I've seen medals mean less than actions, but I think I finally understand yours." She looked at him, eyes tired but clear. "They don't mean victory, Sergeant Major," she said. "They mean endurance." He nodded. Still, you earned all three. Jessica glanced toward the admin building, the windows reflecting the pale light. Fairchild was gone, but the damage he'd done would take time to fade. And maybe that was okay. Because scars, visible or not, remind people what not to repeat. She turned back toward her workshop, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. You can't silence dignity, you can only test it. What happens after the fight ends? When the noise fades, the enemies vanish, and all that's left is the echo of what it cost. Some victories don't feel like triumph. They feel like survival. And survival, Jessica Redmond knew, always comes with a bill. The news spread through Fort Harrison before lunch. Colonel Fairchild, relieved of command. Pending formal investigation. Confined to base quarters until transfer. No announcement. No ceremony. Just a quiet removal, like erasing a name from a doorplate. Some people pretended not to know why. Others whispered pieces of the story, each version smaller and safer than the truth. By evening, the base had returned to its rhythm. Memos, briefings, deadlines. But beneath it all, something had shifted. A tension released. A fear replaced by respect, cautious, quiet but real. Jessica walked through the compound as the sun dipped low over the training fields. Everywhere she went, soldiers nodded subtly, respectfully. Not out of obligation. Out of recognition. Captain Natalie Green stopped her outside the mess hall. "Ma'am," she said softly, "it's strange. People are different now, calmer." Jessica gave a small nod. That's how systems breathe after they've been suffocating too long. Green hesitated, then said, "I don't know how you stayed that calm through everything." Jessica looked out over the compound, the parade field glowing gold in the fading light. "Calm isn't peace, Captain," she said. "It's endurance wearing a clean face." Later that night, she sat alone in her office. The basement that once felt like punishment now transformed into quiet refuge. The hum of the fluorescent light was familiar now, almost comforting. Her desk was neat, ordered, files stacked, pen aligned. But at the center sat a small wooden box. She hadn't opened it in months. She hadn't needed to. Until now. Her fingers hovered over the latch, then lifted it open. 3 bronze stars gleamed faintly under the sterile light, dull from age, untouched for years. Each one represented something she never liked to revisit. The first, Mistral Outpost. An evacuation under fire. 46 soldiers alive because she'd built a bridge that shouldn't have held. She remembered the sound of it, metal under pressure, bolts shrieking, her voice cutting through chaos as she directed fire teams to move. It wasn't bravery. It was math, sweat and fear stitched together. The second, Operation Deep Current. A coastal flood zone, field hospital collapsing under rain and shelling. She'd reinforced the structure with scavenged steel beams, working 36 hours without sleep. By the end, her hands had bled so badly she'd taped them shut. The third. She stared at it for a long time. That one didn't have an official name. No after-action report. No recognition beyond this silent metal. Only she and a handful of people knew. A failed intel drop. A trapped team. An explosion that tore through the compound. And her dragging a wounded radio operator through smoke so thick it felt like drowning in fire. They gave her the medal because they didn't know what else to give someone who'd seen that much and stayed standing. The door creaked open softly. Nicholson stepped in, hesitation in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I didn't mean to intrude." Jessica closed the box halfway. "You didn't." He nodded toward the medals. "Those yours." She gave a small, wry smile. "Technically, yes, but they belong to everyone who didn't make it back." Nicholson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You ever regret staying in?" The question lingered. She thought about it, the long nights, the noise, the silence that followed every mission, the looks, the weight of proving yourself twice to be seen once. "No," she said softly. "I just regret how often this uniform asks us to forget we're human." Nicholson nodded. "You reminded a lot of people here what that means." "I didn't remind them," she said. "They already knew, they just stopped saying it out loud." The following week brought official hearings. Fairchild was gone, his office sealed. Jessica was summoned to testify, not as a suspect but as a witness. The boardroom smelled of old paper and nervous air conditioning. Colonel Hayes sat at the far end, presiding. "Major Redmond," he said, "we're formally closing the investigation. You're cleared of all allegations." She nodded once. "Thank you, sir." Hayes studied her for a moment, then said quietly, "You understand what your silence cost you, don't you?" She met his eyes. "Yes, sir, but sometimes silence protects more than it costs." He leaned back, thoughtful. Most officers would have fought harder to defend themselves. Jessica's voice was steady. "If I had, they'd call it insubordination. If I stayed quiet, they'd call it guilt. Either way, I'd lose. So I chose the one that didn't cost my integrity." Hayes exhaled, a faint smile flickering. "The Army could use more officers like you." "The Army could use fewer reasons to need them," she replied gently. After the hearing, she walked past the flagpole at headquarters. The wind was sharp, the flag snapping against the clear blue sky. For the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe. Not because she felt safe, but because she finally felt heard. The world around her hadn't changed much. But she had. The next few days were quiet. Almost unnervingly so. Work resumed. Meetings, reports, long hours, shorter nights. But beneath the routine, something else had begun, a slow ripple of reform. Captain Green proposed a new transparency initiative for engineering approvals. Pierce restructured data security to prevent administrative tampering. Even Matthews, once Fairchild's echo, started volunteering for the projects Jessica led. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew the culture had shifted. Fear had been replaced by something rarer: accountability. One evening, Jessica was reviewing logistics data when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," she said without looking up. The door opened, and there stood Lieutenant Matthews. He hesitated before speaking. "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize." She looked up slowly. "For what?" "For all of it, the things I said. The way I laughed that day in the briefing. I thought I was being loyal." Jessica regarded him for a long moment. "To whom?" He swallowed. "To the system, to the rank above me." She nodded slightly. "And now?" He looked down. "Now I think loyalty means protecting what's right, not just who's in charge." Her gaze softened just enough. "That's a hard lesson, don't forget it." He nodded. "No, ma'am." As he turned to leave, she added quietly, "And Lieutenant." He looked back. "You're not the first to laugh at me," she said. "Just be the last to laugh at someone else for the same reason." He nodded again, eyes steady this time. "Yes, ma'am." When he left, the room felt a little lighter. Outside, the base glowed under the sodium lights, quiet, still, watchful. Jessica walked across the parade field, her shadow long against the wet grass. She thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the sabotage, the redemption that didn't feel like victory. She thought about the soldiers who'd stood up when it mattered, the ones who stayed silent out of fear, and the few who'd found their courage too late. And she realized something simple, something she wished she'd known years earlier. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't against the enemy in front of you. They're against the voices behind you, the ones telling you to stop standing so tall. The next morning, she placed the wooden box on Hayes' desk. He looked at her confused. "Your medals." She nodded. I want them archived, somewhere they'll mean something. They already do, he said softly. Not to me, she replied. Not anymore. They're reminders of what it costs to prove what should have been believed. Hayes regarded her for a long moment. You're not resigning, are you? No, sir, she said. I'm just shifting my fight. Toward what? She smiled faintly. Training, mentorship, making sure the next woman who walks into a room full of men who underestimate her doesn't have to survive what I did. Hayes nodded slowly. That's how change starts, one stubborn officer at a time. Not stubborn, she said, just tired of watching silence get rewarded. That night she returned to her quarters, the window cracked open to the cold wind. The medals were gone. The desk was clear. The bass outside hummed with quiet order. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, staring out at the dim horizon. In the reflection, she saw herself, tired, older, steady. She whispered softly, "They called me princess. They had no idea." Then she smiled, not out of pride but peace. Because she finally understood something the medals never told her. Strength isn't proven in battle. It's proven in restraint. In the choice to rebuild, even after the world tries to tear you apart. And as the night deepened, that truth sat with her, unspoken, unshakable, and utterly hers. What do you do after survival? When the war, over, not the one on maps, but the one inside the walls where you work. Most soldiers wait for orders. Some search for meaning. Jessica Redmond started building again. Not bridges. Not fortifications. People. 2 months had passed since Colonel Fairchild's removal. Fort Harrison had changed in small, almost invisible ways. Meetings were shorter. Arguments quieter. Decisions slower but fairer. The fear had gone out of the air. Jessica, now officially appointed as Chief Training Officer for Engineering Integration, was back where she belonged, in the field hangars, surrounded by noise, dirt, and possibility. Young officers crowded around drafting tables, sketches, stress diagrams, half-built prototypes. And there she was, sleeves rolled, hair tucked back, speaking in the same quiet tone that could slice through chaos without raising its volume. Blueprints are promises, she told them. You don't just design steel, you design trust. Every bolt you place holds someone's life. Every mistake hides a name. The room was silent, respectful in a way that words didn't require. She didn't lecture like a commander. She spoke like someone who'd earned her authority the hard way, through scars, not stripes. When a young lieutenant asked, "Ma'am, how do you know when you've done enough?" She smiled faintly, "When it still keeps you up at night." The boy blinked confused. She clarified, "Because if you can sleep easily after signing off on something that others will depend on, you've missed the point of leadership." Later that day, she walked the motor pool with Nicholson. The winter wind cut sharp across the concrete, rattling loose sheet metal and flags. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, hands deep in his jacket pockets. "Every time I wake up," she said. He chuckled, "Then why stay?" "Because leaving doesn't fix what's broken. Staying gives it less room to spread." Nicholson nodded slowly. "You know, I've served under more commanders than I can count. Some I respected, some I survived, but you." He stopped, searching for the right word. "You lead differently, quietly, makes people listen longer." Jessica's eyes softened. "That's because I stopped trying to make them listen. I just started doing the work." Word of her new training program spread beyond the base. Other installations began requesting copies of her modules. Field decision-making under stress, ethical command structure, and tactical engineering under duress. Hayes called one evening, "You're becoming famous, you know." She laughed softly, "That's dangerous." "I mean it," he said. "HQ wants to replicate your model at 3 other commands. They're calling it the Redmond framework. She sighed. I didn't build it for recognition. I know that's why it works. There was a pause. Jessica, he said quietly, Fairchild's file is closed. They offered him early retirement. He's gone. I don't wish him ill, she said. After what he did. She looked out the window, watching the lights along the runway. People like him, they already live with the punishment they've earned. They just call it pride. Her program grew fast, too fast for comfort. By March, her classes doubled. She found herself supervising both officers and enlisted recruits, some enthusiastic, some resistant. Resistance, she'd learned, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came with smiles and polite nods, the quiet kind that said, "We'll humor you, ma'am, but this isn't how things are done." She noticed it most in the older lieutenants, men who'd been shaped by a system built before she was ever invited to sit at the table. One afternoon, during a simulation exercise, a trainee named Lieutenant Kessler ignored her safety override order. The structure collapsed, not fatally, but enough to twist metal and ruin equipment. When she confronted him afterward, he shrugged. "With respect, ma'am," he said, "I've done this 100 times. Your new procedures slow the team down." She stepped closer, voice soft but cutting. "You just cost 2 months of material, 3 injured cadets, and 1 chain of command violation. Does that feel faster to you, Lieutenant?" He didn't answer. She continued quietly, almost like she was speaking to herself. Every tradition starts as a shortcut that worked once. Every accident starts as a shortcut that worked twice. Then she turned and walked away, no raised voice, no anger. But the silence she left behind carried farther than any reprimand. That night she stayed late in the hangar cleaning tools, recalibrating sensors, writing notes. The building was quiet except for the echo of distant generators. Captain Green found her there, leaning over a drafting board. "You're not going to let today go, are you?" Green asked. Jessica smiled faintly. "No, I'm not built for forgetting." Green nodded. "He'll learn, they all will." Jessica paused, then said softly, "Maybe, but not all lessons take." "Then why keep teaching?" She looked up, eyes tired but resolute. "Because if even one of them listens, someone down the line might live who wouldn't have." The following week, headquarters invited her to speak at an officer development conference. She declined twice. Public speaking wasn't her world. But Hayes called again. "It's time, Jessica. Not everyone can learn from silence." So she agreed. The auditorium at Fort Bragg was filled with brass, metals gleaming, eyes skeptical. She stood behind the podium in her service uniform, calm, composed. The lights were hot, the microphone too close. When she began speaking, her voice was soft, almost conversational. "I've been asked to talk about leadership, about resilience, about what it means to build under pressure." She paused, scanning the crowd. "But I don't have a theory for that. I only have memories." She told them about the depot, about the audits, about the silence that almost destroyed her career and how it became her weapon instead. She didn't name Fairchild. She didn't need to. By the time she finished, the room was silent, the kind of silence that means reflection, not boredom. She ended simply. "Strength isn't loud, it's steady. It's what keeps you standing when the noise wants you gone." When she stepped off the stage, no one clapped at first. Then one. Then two. Then all of them. It wasn't applause for performance. It was acknowledgement of something they'd forgotten mattered. Afterward, a young officer approached her in the hallway, barely 25, uniform crisp, eyes uncertain. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I just wanted to say I've had days where I thought I wasn't built for this, that maybe I was too soft, too different, but hearing you talk." Jessica smiled gently. "You're not too soft. You're just learning how to stay strong without turning hard. That's harder than any deployment. The young woman blinked, nodding quickly to hide emotion. Thank you, ma'am. Jessica touched her shoulder lightly. You'll be fine. Just don't let them decide how you measure your worth. When she returned to Fort Harrison, the base looked smaller somehow. Not in size, in intimidation. The walls that once whispered judgment now held something different. Respect. And yet she still kept the same old office, basement, buzzing light, uneven floor. Because that space reminded her of the truth. Every command post begins somewhere people stop looking. Nicholson still dropped by most mornings, coffee in hand, same dry humor. One day, he looked at her with a half-smile. You realize you've turned this place upside down without firing a shot. She chuckled softly. It's easier to rebuild when the foundations are cracked. He nodded, then added quietly, You know what people are calling you now. She raised an eyebrow. I'm afraid to ask. The Iron Princess. She laughed, a full, unguarded laugh that echoed against the concrete walls. Let them, she said, as long as they remember the work that came with the name. That night, after everyone left, she stood outside the depot where it had all begun. The floodlights hummed. The air smelled of oil and rain. She walked between the rows of crates she'd once cataloged alone. The tags still bore her handwriting. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that carries memory. And for the first time since that day she'd first arrived, she allowed herself to stop. To breathe. To feel. She leaned against one of the steel columns, looking up at the ceiling where dust caught the light like drifting snow. This is where they tried to bury me, she whispered, and I learned how to grow roots instead. When she returned to her quarters, she found a letter on her desk, official seal, HQ header. It was an invitation, candidate nomination for the Distinguished Service Cross. She read it twice, then set it down without emotion. Because medals didn't define the story anymore. They just marked where silence had survived the noise. She turned off the lamp, letting the moonlight spill across the desk. And in that soft light, she smiled, the kind of smile you give no one but yourself. Because she finally understood what leadership really meant. It wasn't about being followed. It was about leaving behind a standard no one could quietly ignore again. How do you measure a life in uniform? By medals, by missions, or by the silence that follows when the noise is gone? For Major Jessica Redmond, it wasn't any of those things. It was the moments no one saw. The quiet choices, the held tongue, the unfinished sentence that carried more truth than any speech ever could. Spring came late that year to Fort Harrison. The ice melted slow, revealing cracked sidewalks and fresh grass trying to grow through gravel. Jessica stood by the parade field at dawn, coffee in hand, watching the color guard raise the flag. The wind caught the fabric, snapping bright alive. Every morning she watched it rise, and every morning it reminded her why she stayed, not for the rank, or the ribbon, or the ceremony, but for what the symbol meant before people forgot what it stood for. She didn't believe in grand speeches anymore. She believed in presence, in showing up every single day, especially when it was hardest to. That morning, she walked to headquarters for what would be her final review. Her reassignment orders had come through. Transfer, command instructor, Engineering Ethics Division, Fort Belvoir. It wasn't a demotion. It was legacy work. She'd train others, the next generation, the ones who'd never meet Fairchild but might still face men like him. Hayes met her outside the conference room, hands clasped behind his back. End of an era, he said. Or the start of a quieter one, she replied. He smiled faintly. You did good work here, Jessica, more than you know. Then that's enough, she said softly. They walked inside together, the room filled with officers, staff, and new faces she'd trained. There were commendations, short speeches, polite applause. But she barely heard them. Her eyes drifted toward the desk at the front, empty, polished, unremarkable. Fairchild's old desk. The same one that had once held her humiliation like an audience. And something inside her, quiet, unshaken, knew what she needed to do. When the ceremony ended, she waited until the room cleared. Then, without fanfare, she reached into her bag. 3 small velvet cases. Opened carefully. She set them down on the desk, side by side. The bronze stars gleamed under the overhead light, each one reflecting faint fragments of her face. She didn't do it for spectacle. She did it for closure. Because those medals had been heavy too long, symbols of everything she'd endured and everything she'd finally let go of. She whispered, almost to the empty air, "You called me princess. You thought silence was surrender. It never was." Then she stood back, looking at them one last time. No bitterness. No triumph. Just peace. Captain Natalie Green appeared in the doorway, hesitant. "Ma'am." Jessica turned. "You're really leaving?" Jessica nodded. "It's time." Green stepped closer, looking down at the medals. "Why leave them here?" "Because they don't belong on my shelf," Jessica said softly. "They belong where the lesson started." Green frowned slightly. "And what lesson is that?" Jessica smiled, tired, kind. "That dignity doesn't shout, it simply acts." Later that afternoon, she walked the perimeter one last time. The depot. The hangars. The barracks where laughter and argument lived side by side. Every building held a piece of her, not because she'd owned them, but because she'd endured them. Nicholson met her by the gate. "You sure about this?" he asked. She nodded. "You're leaving behind a base that runs better because of you." "I didn't fix it," she said. "I just reminded it how to breathe." He smiled, shaking his head. "You're going to make one hell of a teacher." She chuckled softly. "I already am." They shook hands, firm, mutual respect between equals. As she turned to go, Nicholson called out, "Ma'am, one last thing." She stopped, looking back. "Fairchild's gone, but people like him are. What do you tell your students when they meet their own version of him?" Jessica thought for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Tell them not to waste energy proving themselves to the wrong people. Just keep building, even in silence." Then she walked away. Her flight left that evening. The sky was a washed-out gold, the horizon soft and endless. From the window seat, she watched Fort Harrison shrink below, roads, hangars, training fields, all fatting into a single patch of gray and green. It didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like closure, the kind earned, not granted. She leaned her head back, eyes half closed, as the engines rose into the clouds. In that stillness, memory returned, voices, echoes, moments. "Welcome to Fort Harrison, princess. You think I'm scared of a little dirt. Sometimes silence protects more than it costs." And then the sound of metal against wood. 3 bronze stars on a desk. A statement stronger than any report. Months later, Fort Harrison still carried her name in the air, not in gossip or legend, but in tone. Officers quoted her lessons. Trainees spoke of the Redmond method. Even the depot she'd once cataloged alone now bore a small brass plaque. MAJ, JSSICA Redmond, integrity built here. At Fort Belvoir, she walked new halls, younger faces, untested minds. They didn't know her story, not really. They didn't need to. Her job was to make them remember her. It was to make them ready. In one of her first lectures, a cadet raised his hand. "Ma'am," he asked, "is it true you left your medals behind?" Jessica paused. Then she smiled. "I didn't leave them, I placed them." He frowned. "Why?" "Because some honors aren't meant to be worn," she said. "They're meant to remind. The class was silent, and somewhere deep inside her, she felt something loosen, the last thread of anger gone. That night she walked along the base perimeter, the sky wide and quiet. She thought about everything the last few years had taken, and what they'd given in return. She wasn't naive enough to believe the system had changed overnight. But she believed in ripples, small, steady, unstoppable. And maybe, just maybe, someone would stand taller next time because she'd stayed standing when it mattered. In the stillness, a single memory returned. The night she'd first opened the depot door, facing darkness and dust, and a job meant to break her. That night she'd whispered, "Let him underestimate me." Now, years later, she whispered something different. "Let them remember why they shouldn't have." The wind caught her voice, carrying it into the distance like a promise. The next morning, at Fort Harrison, Sergeant Major Nicholson unlocked the office that had once been Fairchild's. The 3 bronze stars still sat on the desk, untouched. Someone had cleaned around them, but no one dared move them. They weren't trophies. They were truth, polished by time and silence. Nicholson stood there for a long moment. Then quietly he saluted. And far away, in a classroom where sunlight poured across whiteboards and notebooks, Jessica Redmond's voice carried steady and calm. Strength isn't proven by winning arguments or wearing medals. It's proven by the walls that stay standing after you've been tested. She paused, letting the words settle. Then she added, almost to herself, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." The room was silent, not out of fear but reverence. And for the first time in a long time, Jessica Redmond smiled, not because the world had changed, but because she had. The quiet war was over. And this time silence had won.